Hello and welcome to The Complete History of Science. Series 6, Episode 2, Vesalius, the Book of the Body. In 1537, when Vesalius left Louvain, he was still a young man. But, despite his age, he had already built a reputation in the field of anatomy. He was knowledgeable in the sense of book learning, but also, unlike virtually all of his peers, a skilled dissector. During his time in Paris, he had learned a great deal working beside Jean Guinter, and had been the primary assistant helping to compile a great new textbook on Galenic anatomy. Galen had believed that knowledge of anatomy derived from personal, direct knowledge of the human body, and it was this message above all that resonated with Vesalius. Opportunities in Louvain were limited, but fortunately, Vesalius would soon be offered a chance in Italy to expand his research. Upon the award of his medical degree, he was offered a chair in surgery and anatomy at the University of Padua. It formed in around 1222, when a group of around 1,000 students and masters fled Bologna following a dispute with the local townspeople. These refugees settled just outside of Venice, a city which was growing wealthy due to an extensive trade network. The settlers gained the support of the local authorities, who generously funded a new university. Quite early on, Padua became known as a liberal institution, with a reputation for permitting bold ideas. The university motto trumpeted this freedom: Universia Universis Patavina Libertas, or the freedom of Padua is complete for everybody. Over the next couple of centuries, the university continued to grow, in part because of its ability to attract the best masters. The philosophy of the school was that students would seek famous teachers, and therefore they prioritized attracting the most renowned masters. This strategy is in part what led the university to offer Vesalius a place, but the offer was mutually beneficial. Vesalius stood to gain from joining a well-funded medical school, which would offer him the liberty to pursue his own research. On his arrival, Vesalius was not fully qualified to teach, but quickly passed his exams, and on December 5th, 1537, the very next day after his final exam, he performed his first public dissection. Following the traditional order of dissection handed down from the medieval era, Vesalius began with the abdomen, before demonstrating to his audience the thorax, the head, the neck, and the brain. But, rather than follow the set text, he read from the Institutions, the book he had worked on beside his old lecturer, Jean Guinter. His reliance on the Institutions during this lecture demonstrate the deep influence of Galen on his anatomical ideas. At the time, the bulk of the medical curriculum was taken from Arabic sources, but Vesalius was part of a new progressive movement which sought to popularize Galen's work over these more traditional texts. As there were many contradictions between these texts, he, along with other Galenists, was frequently drawn into conflict with more conservative teachers. One particularly venomous argument which was taking place in this period was the debate on how to best perform venesection. Venesection is the practice of bloodletting, which had been used as a form of treatment since at least the time of Hippocrates, 2,000 years prior. By Vesalius's era, venesection was still common practice, but due to its inherent risk, was controversial. The question was not so much whether bloodletting should be allowed, but instead about how it should be practiced. On the one hand, Arabic sources, primarily Ibn Sina, suggested that bleeding should be done at a remote site, for example, in the foot or big toe. This was a common treatment of pleurisy or heart pain, and Ibn Sina suggested it should take place as far as possible from the site of pain. This was the most common method until the early 16th century, when a Parisian physician, Pierre Brissot, argued for an alternative. He instead believed that bleeding should be performed near the site of pain. In the case of pleurisy, for example, he would open a vein in the arm nearest to where the pain was felt. As this argument was based on Galen's writings, Vesalius was inclined to take his side. This was in spite of the fact that this new method was clearly much more dangerous, given that the bleeding was done near major blood vessels. In Italy, he found common cause with other sympathetic Galenists, such as Matteo Cotti, a humanist professor and translator who worked in Bologna. Vesalius was invited to Bologna after the end of term, and initially the two got on well. Cotti showed Vesalius some new editions of works by Galen which he had translated and given commentaries on. But, despite the fact that they agreed that Galen's methods should be followed, they disagreed on how exactly it should be performed. Galen had written that cuts should be made in line or according to straightness. Cotti, like Brissot, believed that this meant that cuts should be made in line with the body. On the other hand, Vesalius, who had intimate knowledge of the azygos vein in question, insisted that he had meant the cut should be made in line with the fibres of the vein. This seemingly minor point caused a major rift between the two men, and they seem to have parted on bad terms. Initially, Vesalius was content to share his thoughts in private, but he was formally invited to enter the debate by his old mentor, Nicholas Florenus, who wrote a letter urging him to share his thoughts. Vesalius' response was published, and in the letter he outlines his own interpretation based on his knowledge of the azygos vein. He supplemented this with his own illustrations, based on his dissections, to demonstrate the supposed superiority of his own method. The letter, however, was not merely a dry interpretation of his own view on bloodletting, but also a polemic against those who disagreed with him. Without naming Cotti explicitly, he made an unsubtle reference to those who interpret Galen without studying the body themselves. In early January 1540, Cotti began a series of lectures on his new interpretations of Galen. He followed a relatively traditional structure, but made a comparative study of various classical and Arabic sources, with the aim of showing the superiority of Galen, and in particular his interpretation of Galen, over other writers. As a committed Galenist, Vesalius should have been quite receptive to such a lecture, but the relationship between the two men had by now turned extremely sour. Vesalius had accused Cotti of not having knowledge of the body, while Cotti responded in kind. He openly referred to Vesalius as a mere dissector, an attitude typical of lecturers at the time, who looked down on those performing the dirty work of dissection. In response, Vesalius performed his own series of lectures, but with accompanying dissections, which he would perform himself. In Vesalius's lectures, he aimed to demonstrate the body as it really was, which led him to occasionally even begin to contradict some of Galen's ideas. For example, Galen had claimed that the liver had 5 lobes, whereas Vesalius, holding up the liver to the audience, declared there was no truth to this statement. Cotti, in his own lectures, became increasingly annoyed with Vesalius, attacking his theories on venesection. Vesalius was in attendance at one of these lectures and stood up to defend himself, openly challenging Cotti. The main point of contention was still on venesection, and in particular a disagreement on the existence of a particular vein. Vesalius invited Corti to the dissection theatre, where he demonstrated there were no veins leading to the ribs, as Galen had claimed. Corti mocked Vesalius, saying, "I am no dissector, but can there not also be other veins nourishing the ribs?" Vesalius hit back, "Where, please, show them to me. I again talk only about what is visible." This argument may sound apocryphal, but was recorded by a student in attendance at the lectures, and what this episode demonstrates was that a rift was opening up between Vesalius and more conservative Galenists. Whereas men like Corti were happy to read and interpret Galen, Vesalius was uncompromising in his commitment to truth, which he believed must ultimately reside in the human body. While this put him at odds with many of his fellow Galenists, it only seems to have increased his popularity with students who were far more open-minded. In Padua, the medical faculty endorsed Vesalius's combative approach, and his burgeoning fame led the university to double his salary in gratitude. He was similarly esteemed by the local authorities, who granted him access to an increased supply of cadavers, allowing him to expand his own research. His dissections had convinced him that Galen, like all the other ancient sources, couldn't be taken at their word, so he set himself the task of fastidiously checking all of Galen's anatomical claims. Concurrently, while he was publicly doubting the ancient doctor, he also agreed to work on a new translation of Galen. Vesalius was only 25 years old, but his knowledge of anatomy as well as ancient Greek made him a prime candidate for the work. One of the largest and most prestigious technical publishers of the century, the Gwynter Press, asked him to create a new comprehensive Latin version of Galen's major work. He embarked on this project alongside his housemate, John Keyes. Keyes was an Englishman, but had found himself a medical student in Padua, and like many of the new wave of physicians, was a great admirer of Galen. Keyes and Vesalius worked together towards the same objective, which was to rid Galen's works of the errors, mistranslations, and other non-Galenic material which had crept into the manuscripts over the centuries. While ostensibly working towards a common goal, Vesalius would at the same time continue his own research. Vesalius found that time and again Galen's writings contradicted what he could see with his own eyes. What's more, with every dissection, he was confirming his suspicion that Galen's anatomy was in great part based on that of animals. He was open about his research, which put him at odds with Keyes. Keyes, a typical humanist, thought Galen infallible, and believed that any errors were the fault of previous editors. As with Corti, this seems to have become a personal dispute, and Keyes accused Vesalius of having corrupted the texts. In truth, Vesalius made very good translations of Galen, and only made small corrections on previous editions. Nevertheless, their working partnership soon ended, and they parted ways after 8 months, on bad terms. Following the completion of his translation, Vesalius returned to work exclusively on his own research. He was more determined than ever that he was correct, and that Galen's work needed to be checked thoroughly in order to rid it of errors. The time he spent editing Galen was invaluable in giving him a deep knowledge of Galen's anatomy, and now he would systematically compare this with his own dissections. His aim was not to throw out the entirety of Galen's anatomy, but to cast a light on each claim to see whether it held up to examination. To this end, he limited himself to not correcting Galen until he had observed a contradiction at least 3 times in different bodies. Around 1540, Vesalius began to piece together this massive research to create a comprehensive text of human anatomy. This work, De Humani Corpus Fabrica Libri Septem, known as the Fabrica, would be an enormous feat encompassing all of human anatomy. He would also include extensive details on his process of dissections, ensuring that he might be subjected to the same scrutiny. Since the Middle Ages, anatomical works had followed the same structure, beginning with the internal organs and working outwards to the bones and extremities. Vesalius broke from this convention, beginning with the bones and then moving on to the muscles, arteries and veins, the nervous system, the internal organs, and finally the brain. In total, the Fabrica would take around 3 years to complete and would reach around 800 pages, including 200 illustrations. The epic scale of this work, completed over a relatively brief period, is a testament to Vesalius's energy and talents. In 1543, the work was sent to publishers, and the first edition quickly sold out, causing a major stir amongst the medical community. Though Vesalius had made public his objections to Galenic authority, the way he dismantled Galen's anatomy enraged some readers. His greatest critic was his old lecturer in Paris, Jacob Silvius. What angered him most was Vesalius's assertion that Galen had not based his conclusions on human dissections, but instead on animals. Silvius and other scholars like him had built careers on studying and teaching Galen, and the idea that they had spent their lives in error must have been deeply painful. Nevertheless, in the pages of the Fabrica, there was a lot of evidence to support Vesalius's claims. For example, Galen described the jaw as being composed of 2 bones, joined at the apex of the chin, a description which clearly derives from canines, where the lower jaw ends in a point. In man, Vesalius found, the jaw comprises a single bone, and even through repeated investigations, Vesalius never found a single exception. Likewise, the sternum or breastbone was, according to Galen, made of 7 parts. This, Vesalius pointed out, is also true in dogs, apes and calves, but certainly not in humans, where 3 bones is more typical. Throughout the Fabrica, Vesalius points out error after error in Galen's anatomy. Silvius, outraged, declared Vesalius a madman. He said, if there were any contradictions, it's more likely that these were due to a decline in human stock, rather than Galen being in error. In all, Vesalius reckoned he had identified as many as 300 such errors, which he laid out in detail in the Fabrica, with illustrations demonstrating the correct anatomy. Perhaps more interesting are the times when the anatomical errors Vesalius found conflicted with Galen's physiology. For example, Galen believed that mucus was an excretion from the brain, which travelled down to the nose. But since the brain and nasal cavity aren't directly connected, he suggested that the bone separating them must be perforated like a sieve to allow the mucus to pass. Vesalius could find no perforations, so instead tried to justify the theory by finding an alternate route. Unfortunately, his explanation was equally as implausible as Galen's. This demonstrates how Vesalius had no viable alternative to Galen's physiology. Instead, he tried to align his new observations with the old theory, often falling short. This is perhaps most evident and most significant in Vesalius's work on the circulatory system. The circulatory system is central to Galen's physiology and his understanding of life. His theory was that food was digested and passed to the liver, which turned it into blood. The blood was then passed to the heart through the vena cava, where it was transported around the body, providing nourishment. Vesalius's dissection undermined this theory by denying that the vena cava had its origin in the liver, showing instead it began in the heart, where it's much thicker. Even more damning was Vesalius's investigation of the heart. In order for Galen's theory to work, blood needed to be delivered from the right chamber to the left chamber in large quantities. Galen believed that blood passed through tiny pores between the chambers of the heart. Vesalius could find no such pores, but suggested no alternative. He must have realized the extent of the issue here, as this observation undermined the cornerstone of Galen's physiology, but with no alternative, he simply carried on, reporting exactly what he observed. The success of the Fabrica might a few generations later have been just the first step in a long and distinguished academic career. Vesalius was still less than 30 years old, and the publication of the Fabrica made him perhaps the most infamous anatomist in Europe. His lectures were also hugely popular, and the university were happy with his work. At this point, where he should have been at the apex of his career, Vesalius stepped away. He accepted a position as one of the imperial physicians to the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, and moved to the royal court. On hearing of his resignation, Duke Cosimo de' Medici offered him a huge new salary to come work in the expanded University of Pisa, but Vesalius declined. He seems to have tired of the academic life. The reasons for this are unclear. Perhaps the criticism was too much to handle. Copies of the Fabrica had sold out, but arguably critics like Silvius were far more vocal than the supporters. Of course, it's also possible there are other reasons Vesalius might have left. The position at the royal court was the same as the one occupied by his grandfather and great-grandfather, and so it may have been due to some sense of family duty or tradition. Regardless of his reasons for leaving, Vesalius had a huge impact on the science of anatomy. His successor at Padua was Rialdo Colombo, who immediately began teaching from the Fabrica. Colombo was, like Vesalius, a bold man, and claimed to have found errors in Galen which had eluded his predecessor. Even among his detractors, Vesalius was influential. After the publication of the Fabrica, many claimed to have directly observed the structures which Vesalius denied, without perhaps realizing they were adopting Vesalius's core argument. If they wanted to show the superiority of Galen, they would have to base their arguments not in books, but in the body. This concludes today's episode, and unfortunately, I'll not be back for a while, as I'm travelling for the next month or so. Nevertheless, I will be doing research to conclude this series, as well as prepare the next, which I'm already anticipating will be the biggest and most complex so far. If you haven't yet, please give us a review or rating on your favourite podcast app, and I'll see you again sometime in autumn.